Eva is 3 years old. She can't read or write, but she's already part of a story that began before she took her first breath. She was born in a time when adults talk about climate crisis and foreign debt, but rarely mention empathy. Her toys are manufactured by a system that enslaves other children in far-flung corners of the planet, and unknowingly, she plays upon the contradiction that will define her era: progress without humanity. Eva represents the paradox of a world that produces more knowledge than compassion, more technology than justice. Eva's birth occurs in a historical context saturated with information and devoid of meaning. She lives surrounded by screens that watch her even when she sleeps. Every gesture of hers could become data, every tear, a market prediction. Behavioral science warns that this new childhood will be the first to grow up under total surveillance, with identities shaped by algorithms that decide what to think, what to desire, what to ignore. Even so, amidst this invisible manipulation, her gaze retains something inviolable: the capacity for wonder. It is this purity that, unknowingly, defies adult cynicism. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han would say that the modern world has replaced discipline with self-exploitation. We are no longer dominated by others, but by the need to perform. She will grow up among exhausted parents, underpaid teachers, and societies that confuse productivity with human value. What she inherits, then, is not just a planet in ruins, but a collective psyche sick with fatigue. Social psychology teaches that civilizations collapse not for lack of resources, but for loss of purpose. And that loss, subtle, silent, is the true legacy of adults who no longer believe in tomorrow. Maria and lucid love as resistance. Maria, Eva's mother, is 28 years old and has a fierce instinct to survive with dignity. She grew up watching her parents work endless hours without being able to escape emotional or economic poverty. She learned that hope is not inherited, it is built daily, with weariness and faith. This generation refuses to accept that childhood should be a war zone. Maria cannot tolerate the idea that children, instead of going to school to study and laugh, are learning how to throw themselves to the ground when they hear clashes between criminals. She cannot fathom that, when they go for a walk in the park, they no longer look to the sky to admire the kites, but out of fear of a drone carrying bombs. She refuses to let paranoia be the norm for her daughter. She belongs to a generation that no longer trusts speeches, but small actions: caring, listening, sharing. Maria embodies the transition from passive indignation to lucid love, that way of loving that is not blind, that does not idealize, that does not wait for permission to act. Her love for Eva is not a romantic emotion, but a political act. Every time she feeds her, every time she protects her from fear, she challenges a system sustained by neglect. Social anthropology recognizes in contemporary mothers a new kind of invisible leadership, that of those who uphold the moral fabric of the world while others destroy it. Today, Maria is marching for the entire Alpha generation, not just for her own. Alongside her, thousands of young people from her generation know they have an ethical commitment to the new generations. And that is, not to stand idly by in the face of corrupt governments. Maria does not need to hold a position to wield power, her very existence is an ethical manifesto. Sweetness and rage coexist within her. When she goes out to work, she feels the tension of a country that promises equality but punishes motherhood. When she returns, she sees Eva sleeping and understands that tenderness can also be a trench. In that moment, her love becomes clarity. She understands that protecting her daughter is not enough, she must transform the environment that threatens her. The pedagogy of hope, as Freire called it, does not begin in the classroom, but in the conscience of those who refuse to normalize injustice. The collective scream. Eve doesn't yet speak in full sentences, but her silence resonates. Maria and her generation have decided to translate it into a choral cry. It is the outcry of those who have grown tired of waiting, of those who have learned that indignation without action becomes self-destruction. From the perspective of mass psychology, this phenomenon represents a collective catharsis, the shift from individual fear to shared courage. Every voice raised against impunity restores a piece of lost social self-esteem. In the streets, that cry sounds like a song, not of hate, but of belonging. Generation Z understands that fighting is also building community, that anger needs direction and purpose. That's why their fury is educational. They denounce, but they also create. They protest, but they also imagine. They know that structural violence isn't dismantled with slogans alone, but with consistency. The protest has become a classroom, a ritual, a form of therapy. And as they march, the faces of their children, like Eva's, are projected onto the banners. They no longer fight only for abstract rights, but for concrete biographies, for childhoods that deserve to grow up without fear, for bodies that should not disappear so that others can thrive. Their movement doesn't seek individual heroes, but rather a multiplied consciousness. They are driven by the certainty that history changes when a generation learns not to repeat its mistakes. The fatigue of the days, sociology of wear and rupture. The world of work has transformed human life into quantifiable output. Work is no longer a means to live, but an end in itself. Maria, like millions of others, wakes up before dawn to face a routine that devours her vital energy. Sociologists call this emotional neo-feudalism, an era where the body becomes property of the system. Sleep is a luxury, rest is guilt. But something is changing. New generations have begun to claim their right to time, a non-renewable and non-negotiable resource. Rest has become a form of silent protest, a strike of the spirit. Saying no to excess is an act of radical rebellion. Every pause, every workday that ends on time, every limit set to smartphone incorporate, it is a political statement against the machine that wants them exhausted and docile. It's the new office epic. In Thebernout, a spark of lucidity has been ignited within the collective. The system expected white-collar slaves, but it has found warriors of the pause. When a worker decides to prioritize their mental health over the company's profit, they are not being lazy, is regaining control over his own life narrative. It is a moral desertion from the cult of productivity, an act of sovereignty over time. From the perspective of contemporary anthropology, this phenomenon redefines the value of leisure, no longer as laziness, but as a sacred space for soul recovery collective. The purpose is not to evade, but regenerate the energy needed for the fight. Z knows that attrition is a tactic of power, and rest, a strategic antidote. In this slow rebellion, Maria finds complicity. Among companions and friends, they weave networks of support, take care of each other's children while marching, share food, and keep each other company. Capitalism fragmented the community, but weariness is rebuilding it. Thus, solidarity is born from exhaustion, organization from exhaustion. And in this social alchemy, hope becomes a habit. The nakedness of power, anatomy of the modern lie. The powerful thought they could control the truth, but they forgot that data can no longer be locked away. The digital age has turned every citizen into a potential witness. A single video, a single image, can bring down entire narratives. Corruption, once invisible, is now visible, shared, and analyzed. However, seeing is not always enough. Information overload can also numb us. Media sociology warns that the challenge is not accessing the truth, but maintaining moral awareness in the face of it. Generation Z knows this. That's why they don't just denounce, they interpret. They transform irony into a critical tool, pop culture into political language. They encode their rebellion in memes and songs. What adults see as distraction, they see as symbolic resistance. They know that humor can be a weapon against despair, and that laughing at power is the most elegant way to undermine its authority. Power, exposed and vulnerable, reacts with violence. But every attempt at censorship only amplifies the message. Thus, new generations have made the internet their agora, the algorithm their battleground. And although the elites try to manipulate it, the seed of truth spreads as quickly as lies. In this silent war, Maria and her people discover that transparency is not just a political imperative, but a way to heal the collective psyche. The grim pact, the captured state and ethics in resistance. In many countries, the line between crime and government has blurred. What was once called corruption is now disguised as a strategic alliance. The language of power has become euphemism. But citizens are no longer fooled, they recognize the stench of the shadowy pact. Political science calls it state capture, the people call it treason. Crime doesn't just infiltrate institutions, he turns them into his lair and redefines the rules of coexistence. When impunity becomes a red carpet for the powerful, the honest citizen seems naive, an anachronism. But precisely that naivete, that moral stubbornness, the act of continuing to believe in decency amidst the mire, is the most subversive spark that remains. Maria understands this, her integrity is not a luxury, but entrenched their ethics are an act of daily defiance. The refusal to kneel before cynicism. This generation has learned to disobey the script of defeat. They know the only reason the corrupt system survives is because it tries to convince the people of their powerlessness. But the Z no longer believes in that resignation. No silence can contain the truth when rage becomes organization. Morality, though fragile, is a plague that spreads in the public square. History is no longer the story of tyrants, but the chronicle of those who dare to come together and believe. And so, while the powerful close ranks in their fortified palaces, the people awaken their consciences in the streets. The real threat to the captured state is not a bomb, but an assembly. That is the silent revolution that tyrants cannot imprison, the one that is born in everyday dignity and in the certainty that fear is a loan that is paid with freedom. The new symbolism, the straw hat as a flag of the future. At the demonstrations, amidst the signs and slogans, a peculiar flag waves, a skull wearing a straw hat. It doesn't represent death, but freedom. It's the symbol of the navigator who defies empires, of the dreamer who refuses to compromise their destiny. Popular culture has become an ethical refuge. What was once entertainment is now emotional pedagogy. That flag unites young people of all languages. It evokes a promise to be loyal to the ideal of justice, even if the world calls them naive. It is the banner of those who seek not power, but meaning. Of those who choose friendship over ambition, truth over expediency. In contemporary iconography, the straw hat has replaced the sword. It is not a weapon of conquest, but of dignity. Power doesn't understand this language because it can't buy it. It underestimates it, ridicules it, but can't extinguish it. In every march, on every social network, the symbol multiplies. And with it, a new narrative, that of the collective hero, the one who doesn't need to be remembered by name, but by their consistency. The memory of the pandemic and the awakening of hope. The pandemic revealed what political discourse had been hiding, the fragility of the system and the greatness of the people. Maria saw mothers walking miles so their children could connect to classes. She saw teachers teaching from borrowed cell phones, volunteers distributing food, and neighbors sharing what little internet they had. Meanwhile, the corrupt officials took refuge in luxury hotels using public funds. That image, of obscene inequality, was seared into the subconscious of a generation. But another image also remained etched in our minds, that of spontaneous solidarity. That was the seed of awakening. The sociology of hope teaches that societies do not change by decree, but through emotional contagion. During the crisis, that contagion was love in action. The pandemic was both mirror and oracle. It revealed the worst of the system, but also the best of humanity. Since then, Maria and millions of others have understood that reconstruction will not only be economic, but ethical. That it is not enough to reactivate markets, it is necessary to reactivate trust. And this task, invisible but monumental, is what young people around the world are taking on. The legacy of the future, when Eve awakens. Someday, Eva will grow up and see the records of this time. She will see videos, photos, marches, speeches. And she will know that there was a generation that refused to surrender. That raised its voice for her before she could speak. She will understand that freedom was not a gift, but an inheritance won with sacrifice, tenderness, and clarity. Eva will be the embodiment of the collective awakening. In her gaze will coexist the tears of Mary, the cries of protest, the songs of hope, and the silences of the fallen. And when he utters his first conscious words, his first act will not be a word, but a certainty. She will not say I am afraid or I am alone, but I am here and the future is mine. Because there was a generation that, in the midst of collapse, chose to love intelligently and resist with dignity. And that will be the most lasting lesson, that true freedom doesn't consist of doing whatever you want, but in caring for what you love. That day, when Eva walks among reborn trees and open schools, she will remember, perhaps without knowing why, that the world once teetered on the brink of the abyss. But that someone, at some march, in some corner of the planet, said with a firm voice, no more. And that was enough to start over.